The courtroom was full, sunlight poured in through the tall windows, but the atmosphere inside was tense, like a taut string, standing in the center of the room. Pamela Jo Bondi surveyed the proceedings, feeling the slight nervous excitement that always comes with an important case, but her face betrayed no emotion. She was prepared. This case was not just a professional challenge for her, but a real battle in which the stakes were very high. On the other side of the table sat her opponent, an experienced and long-serving lawyer who seemed to think he was invincible, but Pamela knew that no one could be invincible unless they did their job with due care and knowledge, and in this case, there were several subtle points that could prove decisive. The trial concerned a major issue: violations of civil rights during the investigation of a recent case, problems with the admission of evidence, erroneous interpretations of the law, and vagueness in the decision-making all indicated that the judge assigned to hear the case was clearly unprepared for its complexity. But the judge was not just experienced, he was known for his tough character and his tendency to withstand criticism. Everyone who dealt with him knew that he had his own system, and it was dangerous to violate it. And now Pamela was preparing to confront him. She knew that her job was not only to protect the interests of her client, but to find out where this legal failure had occurred, and perhaps in this process she would have to face the system itself, those who considered themselves infallible. The judge, Michael Whitson, was known for his sternness. He had a reputation for being intolerant of other people's opinions and for questioning any attempt to impose order in his chambers. Many had heard stories of him tormenting lawyers with his questions, refuting their arguments, and making decisions that left his colleagues in serious doubt, but no one dared to confront him openly. Everyone who met him face to face preferred to submit to his will rather than fight. However, Pamela was not one to bow to authority. She always looked for weaknesses in any situation, especially in court cases, and now she knew that if she could find those weaknesses in the judge, it could significantly change the course of the case. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Pamela and her team pored over all the materials. They reviewed every document, researched every legal precedent, and looked for any inconsistencies in the judge's actions that might affect the final decision. It was a lot of work, and every step was important. Pamela was confident that if she was prepared, she could uncover flaws in the process and lead the case to victory. On the day of the trial, Pamela arrived in the courtroom a little early. She wore a formal suit, which emphasized her professionalism and readiness for any situation. As always, she was not in a hurry. Every step she took was measured. Every glance at her face was aimed at assessing what was happening in the courtroom. She was ready for any development of events. Judge Michael Whitson was already in his seat, engrossed in his papers. He was tall, with a lined face, and he looked sternly at his subordinates. His face was expressionless, and it seemed as if he were not just the judges, but the embodiment of the justice system itself. Pamela knew that if she played the old game, being a simple defense attorney, she would fail. She had to find his weakness, manipulate the facts, and lead him into a corner where he couldn't escape. As soon as the hearing began, Pamela sat down in her seat, but her gaze was already fixed on the judge. His words, his manner of conducting the hearing, everything he did was important to her. In every phrase, Pamela looked for signs that he did not quite understand the essence of the case. The judge began, giving absolutely no emotional reaction to the words of the lawyers, as if his case was just a formality. But Pamela couldn't afford to relax. She knew this was just the beginning, that her big job was just beginning. A sense of confidence was growing inside her. She was ready to uncover all the hidden contradictions that would prevent the judge from making a fair decision. In the moments that followed, as the judge continued to read his pre-trial remarks, Pamela sat in the shadows, watching and assessing his every move. Strategies began to form in her mind that she would use when the time was right, and while the first day would not bring great revelations, it would form the basis for her future work. Pamela knew that winning wasn't always easy, but if she played by the rules and bent them a little, she would definitely achieve her goal. The day after the first court hearing, Pamela Jo Bondi sat in her office, absorbed in the case file. Her fellow experienced lawyers sat around the table and discussed the details, but Pamela was focused solely on analyzing the work of Judge Michael Whitson. She carefully reread his previous decisions and compared them with the current case, trying to find even the slightest inconsistency. With each decision she read, her sense of unease grew. Judge Whitson, despite his reputation, was not without fault. Pamela had discovered several dangerous patterns. His decisions were often vague, he undervalued some evidence, and, most alarmingly, he sometimes used legal precedents that Pamela believed could be misinterpreted. This was something to be aware of. Throughout her career, Pamela had grown accustomed to the idea that the justice system was not only about legal precision but also about a reasonable approach to the truth. Whitson did not always seem to adhere to this principle. She opened his recent case law on similar situations. In one case, where the question of the admissibility of evidence was being considered, Whitson himself had ordered that a number of important pieces of evidence be ignored, citing outdated practice. The decision was controversial, but no one had attempted to challenge it, unwilling to confront such an authority. But Pamela noticed that this decision was the key to calling him into question in the current trial. In another case, a judge had wrongfully limited an expert's evidence, citing technical errors in the analysis. Pamela realized that this might be a weakness that she would need to address, but the biggest revelation was that the judge seemed to her to frequently make decisions without considering the relevance of the evidence or its weight in the context of the entire case. This clearly indicated a desire to end the trial as quickly as possible, which did not always lead to the right conclusions. After Pamela had sorted through all the data, she realized that to win this case, she would have to attack not only the legal side of the decision, but also the judge himself. She realized that he was not just prone to making mistakes in his assessment of the situation, he ignored important details, which could lead to an unfair decision, and her job was to create the conditions for his mistakes to become obvious to everyone. She decided to tread carefully, to avoid giving Whitson the chance to suspect that she was preparing to expose him. Pamela knew that he would not like it if she immediately began to question his authority, but a clear strategy had already formed in her mind. She had to create counter-arguments to his decisions, leading him to the realization of his own mistakes through legal evidence and facts. This was her strategy, not to openly attack, but to skillfully build a line of defense. That evening, she met with several colleagues to discuss the plan of action. They mapped out a strategy for questioning witnesses and preparing all the documents. The most important element of the plan was that Pamela decided to use silent confrontation with the court. She would not directly address its mistakes, but she would manipulate the situation, putting its decisions in an uncomfortable position. When Pamela returned home, she read the papers again. Thoughts flashed through her mind that this case could be an important moment in her career. If she could prove that the judge was incapable of correctly assessing the circumstances, it would open up new horizons in her professional life. But she also knew that this process would require her utmost concentration and attention. The next day, when the trial resumed, Pamela walked into the courtroom with a new sense of confidence. The judge, as before, looked calm and determined. He did not know that his attention would be directed to far more serious issues than he could have imagined. Pamela knew that her task now was not simply to win, but to prove that the legal process itself was vulnerable, and that it was its very approaches that led to mistakes. As the trial continued, Pamela carefully began to buttress her arguments. She cited legal precedents that she felt had not been properly considered by the court and pointed out flaws in the expert opinions the judge had used. Pamela used every opportunity to question his decisions without crossing the line and angering him openly. And though the judge remained calm, Pamela felt the pressure begin to mount. She knew he was aware of her subtle attempts to turn the tables, but he was not prepared to respond immediately. That was her victory. She was able to plant a seed of doubt in his confidence, putting him in a position where he would have to justify his actions. And although there was no final decision at this stage, Pamela knew that she had begun to create space for her next steps, and now her job was to not give the judge the opportunity to get out of this situation without consequences. When Pamela Jo Bondi returned to the courtroom for the third day of the trial, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Michael Whitson was going to conduct a series of cross-examinations today, and Pamela knew this was the key to making her case and undermining the judge's confidence. The strategy of the previous days had come to a head. The time had come to strike with precision and no margin for error. This time the judge was less sure of himself. Pamela noticed how he was increasingly looking at his notes, as if something was bothering him, but he tried not to show it. Maintaining his usual unapproachable manner, he began with brief remarks on the case, but Pamela already knew that this would not be a simple procedure. She would be looking for loopholes. When Pamela stood up to speak, her presence was immediately felt in the room. She walked slowly, calmly, and confidently to the podium. The judge looked at her with undisguised displeasure, as if he was already prepared to defend his position, but Pamela felt no fear, because she knew that her arguments were irrefutable. This was the decisive moment. Now she had to present her strategy with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Your Honor, before we move on to questioning the witnesses, I would like to bring to your attention several significant legal issues that I believe were not adequately addressed during the preliminary hearing, she began, her voice confident and persuasive. The judge narrowed his eyes, but said nothing. He knew that Pamela had always stood out among the other lawyers for her sharp wit, but today she was especially determined. She immediately cited examples from Judge Whitson's previous decisions, pointing out the obvious legal errors he had made in similar cases. His decisions were not just questionable, they were contrary to the basic principles of the law that the judge, as an experienced lawyer, was expected to uphold. In one of your previous decisions, Your Honor, you ignored evidence that was important in this context, she continued, as everyone in the courtroom watched her every word. Here in this case, we are faced with a similar situation, and the same approach, in my opinion, violates not only the principles of fairness, but also the law. Pamela used these errors as the basis for her next argument. She argued that if the judge continued to ignore the strong evidence in the case, it would lead to his decision being found to be unreasonable. But Pamela knew she had to be careful. If she went too aggressively against the judge, it could backfire on her, so she chose a path that cloaked her criticism in clear, hard legal facts. The judge's voice was tense as he began to answer. He was trying to contain his irritation, but he couldn't hide his confusion. I believe all decisions were made within the law, he said, measuredly, but with a clear hint that he hadn't expected such open criticism. Pamela didn't back down. Your Honor, I respect your position, but I cannot agree with it. We all know that the court's most important job is to ensure justice. However, if we were to allow an erroneous decision to stand, we would only create more legal issues. I believe that you understand the importance of correctness in all steps taken by the court, and your refusal to consider other evidence can be seen as underestimating the rights of our clients. Her words were clear and unwavering. The judge was silent, but his eyes betrayed his confusion. He had not expected Pamela to attack his decision so confidently, so constructively and precisely. Pamela felt her words begin to wash over him, undermining his confidence in his actions, but she was not going to stop there. Furthermore, she continued, if we do not discuss the legal precedents I have cited, we risk setting a dangerous precedent for future cases. We all know that any mistakes made at this stage could create long-term problems for the justice system. The room was silent, and Pamela felt her influence on the judge growing. She wasn't trying to knock him down right away, but every word she said was carrying weight, and she could feel the judge getting nervous. At that moment, Pamela knew she had seized the initiative. The judge was on the verge of admitting his mistake, but he was still trying to keep his cool. The judge finally said, I'll take your comments into account, but let's move on with the trial. His voice was still firm, but there was already a hint of doubt in his words. Pamela knew that the judge was forced to admit that she had put him in a difficult position, but she also knew that this was only the beginning. As soon as the judge called a break, Pamela returned to her seat with satisfaction. She felt that her strategy was beginning to bear fruit. Not only had she questioned the judge's decisions, but more importantly, she had made him think about his actions. She knew that with each new step, she would be closer to victory, but it was important to remain calm and confident until the very end. Her standoff with the court was not just a clash of two legal minds, it was a fight for justice and for a correct understanding of the law, and Pamela was ready to prove that the truth cannot be hidden, no matter how strong the one trying to suppress it. Day after day, the trial continued, and Pamela Jo Bondi was acutely aware that the time for her strategic strike was approaching. The second week of the trial was marked by Judge Michael Whitson becoming visibly nervous. His words became more abrupt, his decisions more hasty. Pamela knew that now, when her opponent was on the verge of indecision, she had to act decisively and without unnecessary doubts. She decided that it was high time to bring the judge to the point where he could not retreat without admitting his mistakes. Every move she made in the courtroom, every remark and argument, was carefully calibrated to the smallest detail. Pamela knew that the point was not simply to win the case, but to break it down into legal elements and demonstrate the weakness of her opponent, the judge, whose reputation and confidence were now beginning to crumble. She was preparing to show that the mistakes made earlier in the trial were not accidents, but the result of the system the judge had built around himself. Today, Pamela knew she couldn't afford to make the slightest mistake. This was her last chance to undermine the judge before he made his final decision. The trial began. The judge sat back at his desk, this time even more reserved than usual. He read documents and took notes, but his attention was clearly distracted, as if he were searching for a way out of the situation. Pamela sat in the back, but her gaze was focused. She knew that her next speech would be the deciding factor. The hearing continued in the usual manner for everyone. At this point, Pamela, taking advantage of the moment, passed through her colleagues to the prosecution lawyers several sheets of paper with questions and comments prepared in advance. Everything was ready for the next step. She knew that this time she would have to exploit the judge's weakness, and that it was precisely by undermining his legal arguments that she would emerge victorious. When it came time to cross-examine the key witness, Pamela stood up, but rather than simply ask questions, she decided to launch into a strong legal attack. She pointed out several inconsistencies in the witness's testimony and suggested that the fact that the witness had been coerced should be brought to light. But there was another, more subtle point here that Pamela reserved for herself to exploit at the right moment. She knew that doubts about the credibility of the testimony could destroy an entire section of the prosecution's case. Your Honor, before we proceed, I would like to bring to the court's attention several important facts that may impact our trial. Pamela began, her voice firm and clear. She glanced at the judge, letting him know that this was a crucial moment. She drew attention to the fact that the judge had repeatedly refused to accept the more compelling evidence presented in their defense, citing its irrelevance. Pamela also noted that his interpretation of precedents was so superficial that it could influence her client. It didn't just seem that way, it was obvious. There was no doubt to anyone who had followed the trial closely that the judge's decisions were based on disregard for a number of legal rules that exist in cases of this nature. If the judge insists that the precedents we cite are irrelevant, then perhaps he has overlooked one important detail. The case we are talking about involves established case law that we should have taken into account under the current legal system. She continued. Pamela knew that this argument was strategic. She was taking aim not only at the judge's decision, but at his approach to the law in general. Your Honor, if the decision you make does not take these precedents into account, we risk setting a dangerous precedent for all of justice, and I'm sure you would not want to be part of a story in which justice is called into question. Her words echoed like thunder in the courtroom. The judge tried to restrain himself, but was clearly confused. He fell silent, trying to formulate his position, but Pamela already knew that she had achieved her goal. He could not remain indifferent to her statements. "You are, of course, entitled to your point of view," the judge finally said, but there was a hesitation in his voice that was completely absurd for such an experienced judge, however. But Pamela was ready. She didn't let him finish his sentence, already exposing another legal point. "However, Your Honor, we all know that ignoring the law and precedent cannot be justified even by your position. Let us consider the fact that in such an important case, your decision will be viewed critically by all participants in the justice system, and this is not just a matter of individual case, it is a matter of principle." The courtroom fell silent. Pamela felt the tension rising. Every step she took, every word she said, was aimed at completely undermining the judge's confidence and putting him in an awkward position. Pamela saw that he could no longer ignore her arguments. The judge sighed, opened several documents in front of him and began to write something down. His demeanor became less confident, and although he tried to maintain the appearance of control, Pamela knew that she had already won. He began to look for excuses for his actions, but now it was only a matter of time. She continued her line of defense, not giving him the slightest chance to maneuver. When the session finally ended, Pamela knew that her intellectual attack, her strategic moves, and her legal precision had paid off. The judge who had once seemed invincible was now placed in a situation where his mistakes were inevitable. Pamela returned to her seat, but her eyes were now full of confidence. She understood that she had won not just a legal battle, but a crucial battle for justice. Pamela Jo Bondi felt that the moment had come when her efforts would have their final outcome. The final day of the trial was the culmination of all her actions, her thoughtful strategy and legal maneuvering. Pamela knew that Judge Michael Whitson, despite his attempts to maintain faith and confidence, had been put in a position where his decisions were now vulnerable and in doubt. Today, one thing was clear. This was the day when her previous actions would bear fruit. Every step she had taken had been calculated down to the last detail, and now she was preparing for the decisive moment. This was her last chance to win the case, but most importantly, to demonstrate that truth and justice were more important than personal ambitions or the failure of the judicial system. The hearing began with the usual formality, but the atmosphere was different. In the courtroom, the judges and lawyers sensed that the situation had become tense. Pamela made no secret of her confidence in her plan and that she was already one step away from victory. All she had to do was wait for the moment when Whitson, unable to withstand the pressure, made a decision. On this day, as the final stage of the trial approached, Pamela decided to play her strongest card. She prepared a closing statement that would not just be a defense of her client, but a real legal blow, undermining the entire logical structure on which the judge had built his decisions. Pamela stood up, her voice firmer and more confident than ever. She knew that she had to do more than just say the words, but convince everyone present that the judge, despite his best efforts, had made several key errors that could not go unnoticed. "Your Honor, we have reached the final stage of this trial. We have been through a long and difficult journey, during which strong evidence, testimony, and legal arguments have been presented. However, as we all know, there have been errors in the process that cannot be ignored if justice is to be done." The room fell silent. There was clarity and power in her words. Pamela continued. "Your Honor, throughout this trial we have encountered numerous violations of legal norms that could seriously affect the future of this case. We cannot ignore that your previous decisions, based on underestimation of evidence and disregard of important precedents, could jeopardize the entire process of justice." Every word she said was aimed squarely at the target. Pamela not only described the judge's legal errors, but she did so in such a way that his actions became more than just a topic of discussion. They became a question mark over the competence and even fairness of the judicial system. She emphasized how important not only was the outcome of this case, but also how such errors could affect future trials. The judge's errors, in her view, could set a dangerous precedent for the entire justice System in the country. If we don't take all these facts into account now, we risk creating situations where justice is in question. Not just in this case, we risk losing confidence in the justice system, and I'm sure you don't want to be a part of that. The room fell silent again. Everyone in the room felt the pressure on the judge growing. He was silent, looking at Pamela. His face was confused. Although he tried to maintain an outward calm, Pamela knew that this was the decisive moment. Now there was only one thing to do: wait for the judge's reaction. The judge seemed to be trying to justify his actions, but Pamela had already set a trap. She knew that if he tried to answer with confidence, her next steps would only make things worse for him, and so, the judge broke the pause. "I understand your arguments, Ms. Bondi, but I believe that all decisions were made within the framework of the current legislation. We cannot take responsibility for interpreting every legal nuance." These words were the very moment Pamela had been waiting for. She calmly but confidently replied, "Your Honor, this is not a question of interpretation. This is a question of fairness. Every legal nuance matters, and when decisions are made on the basis of incomplete or erroneous data, it violates the very essence of justice." Pamela paused, as if to let everyone know that if the judge ruled in her favor now, it would not just be the result of a trial, it would be a challenge to all norms of law and justice, and she was prepared to fight for that challenge to the end. When the judge finally called a recess to make a decision, Pamela felt her heart begin to beat faster. Everything was on edge. She knew that her words had challenged not only the arguments, but the very basis of the judge's decisions. The judge couldn't just ignore her arguments. The break was short, but Pamela already knew that the judge was finding himself trapped. When he returned to the courtroom and announced his decision, his voice was not as firm as before. "After careful consideration of all the arguments, I am forced to admit that some of the arguments you have presented have merit. The decision taken in the case may be reviewed." It was an admission of error, not a complete one, but significant enough to call into question the entire line of the judge's previous decisions. The room exploded with discussion. At that moment, Pamela knew that even though the trial was not yet over, she had already won. The judge was forced to admit that his actions were not impeccable. This was not just a legal battle, it was a victory for logic, truth, and justice. Pamela Jo Bondi not only won the case, but also showed that the truth will always find a way, even when the system tries to hide it. As Pamela left the courtroom, she felt relieved, but also satisfied that she had taken the legal battle to a new level. This case was not only a personal victory for her, but also a significant step in her legal practice. In the end, Judge Michael Whitson, a great and experienced lawyer, was defeated not by force, but by intelligence, strategy, and determination. The fate of the trial was now decided, but for Pamela Jo Bondi it was not only a moment of triumph, but also a new phase. She had won a victory that was not just a legal victory, but a victory of principle. Judge Whitson had been forced to admit his mistakes, which played a significant role in changing the course of the case, but the trial itself left a deep mark not only on the legal system, but on her career as well. As Pamela walked out of the courthouse, she felt her colleagues and her legal team lifting her up. It was an absolute victory. Not only had they won the case, but they had demonstrated that true justice will always find a way, even when the system tries to hide it. But behind the facade of public recognition and applause, Pamela felt her fight was not over. She knew that, despite her personal victory, the justice system did not always function as it should. Whitson's mistakes were symptomatic of a broader problem, the disrespect for the law and an underestimation of the importance of objectivity in decision-making. The court system, like any institution, is not perfect, but for Pamela, this was the moment when she felt her mission as a lawyer transcended her personal interests. She realized that her job was not just to protect her clients, but to protect the very essence of justice, no matter how difficult it may be to fight those in power. The press and public attention to the case only increased. As did Pamela herself, everyone was talking about her strategy, her legal acumen, and her determination. Her name became known outside the legal profession, and her approach to the case was seen as a role model. Many began to wonder how she had been able to so convincingly refute a respected judge who was experienced and confident in his actions. The answer was simple. Pamela believed in the law, she believed in justice, and she was not afraid to go against the system if she saw that the system was not working correctly. But despite all the congratulations and recognition, Pamela was humble. She knew the work was not over, but rather a new chapter was beginning. This victory was not only her personal achievement, but also a symbol of the importance of staying true to your principles, even when you are faced with the most powerful system. Pamela considered what would happen next. She understood that this case had given her an incredible experience, but also a responsible understanding of how important it was to change the legal culture. In her work, she had always strived to be not just a lawyer, but a true defender of the law, and this case only strengthened her belief in this. The next step in her career was to expand her work to include law reform. Pamela knew that her skills and knowledge could help not only in individual cases, but also in a more global context. She began to actively work with colleagues, lawyers, and experts, seeking to reform systems where wrong decisions and injustice can flourish. She also drew attention to the need for reform in the judicial training system and higher standards of professional ethics. In the end, the victory over Judge Whitson was not just a personal milestone, but also a symbol of the fight to improve the legal system as a whole. Meanwhile, Pamela continued to work on new cases, actively advising her clients and developing strategies based on legal rigor and principles of fairness. With each new case, she became increasingly convinced of the importance of what she was doing. She was sure that her victories in court were not just the result of her work, but steps towards a greater cause, correcting the shortcomings that sometimes permeate the justice system itself. Soon Pamela was being talked about as a possible candidate for key legal positions. Her successes in reforms and legal cases made her a figure whose opinion became significant for the entire legal system of the country, but she was in no hurry to accept such offers. It was more important for her to focus on her work, on the legal protection of people, and on the principles that she always defended. As time passed, Pamela Jo Bondi continued to influence the legal system, her cases becoming important precedents for future generations of lawyers. Her approach to justice and her pursuit of fairness became a symbol of the importance of having the courage to go against the system when that system fails to fulfill its primary purpose of serving truth and law. With each passing year, her reputation only grew stronger, and she became a living example of how even one person can change the course of history if they act with honor, determination, and respect for the law.